Babylon, June, 323 BC. Inside the stifling heat of a palace chamber, a 32-year-old man lies burning with an uncontrollable fever. Surrounding the deathbed are battle-hardened Macedonian generals, men who had conquered the known world, now weeping like helpless children. When asked to whom he leaves his colossal empire, spanning over 2 million square miles, the dying conqueror whispers his final verdict: to the strongest. In 12 relentless years of campaign across 3 continents, he had never lost a single battle. His name was Alexander of Macedon. 33 years earlier, in the rustic northern kingdom of Macedonia, a royal child was born into a world of blood and ancient ambition. His mother, Queen Olympias, a fierce mystic of Dionysus, whispered a secret into the boy's ear, that his true father was not a mortal king, but Zeus himself. Yet it was his mortal father, King Philip II, who forged the military machine that would one day conquer the Persian superpower. Philip transformed simple farmers into professional killers, arming them with the 18-foot sarissa pike, creating the unstoppable Macedonian phalanx. To educate his prodigy, Philip hired the greatest philosopher of antiquity, Aristotle, taught the young prince politics, medicine, and the heroic glory of the Iliad. Alexander slept with a dagger and a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, obsessively dreaming of surpassing his legendary ancestor, Achilles. In 344 BC, a Thessalian horse dealer brought an untamable black stallion to Pella. No veteran rider could mount the beast. 12-year-old Alexander noticed what everyone else missed. The magnificent animal was simply terrified of its own dancing shadow. Gently turning the stallion toward the sun, Alexander spoke softly, stroked its trembling neck, and gracefully vaulted onto its back. To the astonished silence of the court, the boy galloped effortlessly across the plain. Master of the horse he named Bucephalus Oxhead. Weeping with awe, King Philip embraced his young son and proclaimed, "My boy, look thee out a kingdom equal to thyself. Macedonia is too small for thee." By 338 BC, King Philip marched south to subjugate the defiant Greek city-states of Athens and Thebes at the fateful Battle of Chaeronea. Opposing them stood the legendary Sacred Band of Thebes, 300 elite sworn warriors who had never once tasted defeat in battle. Commanding the companion cavalry on the left wing, 18-year-old Alexander seized the critical moment and launched a ferocious, spear-shattering charge. The Sacred Band was annihilated to the last man. Chaeronea was won, and Greek independence fell under the Macedonian spear. Yet triumph brought deadly court intrigue. In 337 BC, Philip took a new young Macedonian bride, Cleopatra, threatening Alexander's royal succession. When the bride's uncle toasted a legitimate heir, Alexander hurled his goblet in fury. An enraged Philip lunged at his son, only to trip drunk onto the stone floor. Alexander sneered, "Behold, the man who prepares to pass from Europe into Asia, but falls passing from couch to couch." He fled into exile with his mother. October, 336 BC. At the ancient royal capital of Aegae, Philip hosted a lavish festival to heal family rifts and launch his Persian invasion. When the city of Thebes revolted, believing him dead, Alexander marched 250 miles in 14 days, storming and razing the city to ash. Terrified by the brutal demonstration, Greece submitted. At the League of Corinth, Alexander was officially proclaimed supreme commander of the grand invasion of Asia. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led an expeditionary force of 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry to the edge of Europe. Aboard his royal flagship, the young king crossed the narrow waters of the Hellespont, leaving the lands of his ancestors behind forever. As the bow touched the shore, Alexander cast his iron-tipped spear into the Asian sand, claiming the Persian Empire as land won by the spear. Before marching to war, he made a sacred pilgrimage to the windswept ruins of ancient Troy to pay homage to the heroes of Homer's Iliad. At the tomb of Achilles, Alexander anointed the stone pillar with oil and laid golden wreaths, praying for immortal glory matching his mythical forefather. Inside the ancient temple of Athena, he took down a sacred bronze shield from the Trojan War, which his bodyguards carried before him in battle. 70 miles to the east, the Persian satraps of Asia Minor assembled 20,000 cavalry and Greek mercenaries along the steep banks of the Granicus River. The Persian commanders positioned their elite cavalry along the high riverbank, daring the young Macedonian invaders to attempt a suicidal crossing. Veteran General Parmenion urged caution, advising against attacking across the treacherous muddy waters at dusk. Alexander brazenly refused to wait. Plunging his horse into the turbulent current, Alexander led the companion cavalry directly into the rushing water beneath a hailstorm of Persian javelins. A savage, swirling melee erupted in the muddy shallows as Macedonian riders fought desperately against elite Persian nobles for a foothold on the slippery bank. Recognizable by his towering white helmet plume, Alexander became the primary target. A Persian noble shattered his helmet with a devastating axe blow. As another Persian lord, Spithridates raised his scimitar to deliver the fatal strike. Cletus the Black severed the enemy's arm mid-air, saving Alexander's life. With Alexander rallying his men, the disciplined Macedonian phalanx pushed across the river, shattering the Persian center in an unstoppable wave of bronze. The first great battle for Asia was won. Alexander sent 300 suits of captured Persian armor to Athens with the inscription, "From Alexander and the Greeks." Following the victory at Granicus, Persian authority in Asia Minor collapsed. The Greek cities of Ionia opened their gates, hailing Alexander as their liberator. Yet at Halicarnassus, Persian forces under the brilliant Greek mercenary Memnon of Rhodes mounted a ferocious defense, torching the city before escaping by sea. Facing a Persian fleet of 400 warships, Alexander made an audacious gamble. He disbanded his own navy, resolving to conquer the Persian fleet on land. During the winter of 334 BC, the army marched along the treacherous cliffs of Mount Climax. When the north wind blew back the sea, men believed the waters bowed to it. Pushing inland through freezing blizzards in the rugged Taurus Mountains, Alexander subjugated fierce hill tribes, never allowing his men a moment of rest. In the spring of 333 BC, the army regrouped at Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia, home to one of antiquity's greatest and most enduring enigmas. Inside the citadel temple stood the ancient wooden wagon of King Gordius, its yoke fastened to a pole with an impossibly intricate knot of cornel bark rope. For centuries, an oracle foretold that whoever could untie this seamless knot would become the undisputed master of all Asia. Alexander sought to test destiny. Seeing no hidden ends, Alexander declared, "It matters not how it is loosed." He drew his sword and cleaved the knot in two with a single devastating stroke. That very night, thunder shook the citadel of Gordium. Alexander poured libations to the gods, confident that Zeus had sanctioned his bold solution. 1,000 miles to the east, in the grand palaces of Babylon, the great King Darius III mobilized the full might of the Persian Empire. Over 100,000 soldiers from 20 satrapies marched westward, Median cavalry, scythed chariots, and the elite 10,000 immortals. Learning that Darius was marching to meet him, Alexander raced south at breakneck speed, securing the narrow, treacherous pass known as the Cilician Gates. In Tarsus, Alexander fell violently ill after bathing in the icy Cydnus River. Despite a letter warning his physician Philip was bribed to poison him, Alexander drank the medicine while handing him the letter. In November 333 BC, the two armies passed each other blindly on opposite sides of the Amanus Mountains. Darius had cut Alexander's rear. The trap at Issus was sprung, November 333 BC. On a narrow coastal strip barely 2 miles wide, between the Gulf of Issus and steep mountains, the two empires collided. Darius stationed himself in the center, atop his towering golden war chariot, protected by the immortals and 10,000 Greek mercenary hoplites. Riding down the line, Alexander called out veteran officers and common soldiers by name, reminding them of past glories and immortal renown. To prevent Persian archers from finding their range, Alexander advanced his right wing at a slow, disciplined walk, maintaining perfect, unbroken formation. Once within bowshot, he unleashed the charge. The companion cavalry surged across the shallow river like an avalanche of iron and bronze. The Persian left flank shattered almost instantly under the fury of the shock charge, fleeing in panic into the rugged mountain ravines. But in the center, disaster loomed. The Macedonian phalanx broke ranks, climbing the steep, muddy riverbank, engaged in a desperate bloodbath against Greek mercenaries. Instead of pursuing the routed left wing, Alexander wheeled his cavalry sharply inward, spotting the golden chariot of Darius III across the chaotic field. In the savage melee around the wheels, Alexander was struck in the thigh by an enemy sword, but refused to yield a single inch of ground. With his chariot horses pierced and rearing in agony, panic seized Darius. The King of Kings leaped from his chariot, mounted a horse, and fled the battlefield. Seeing their great king flee, the Persian army broke into a catastrophic rout. Thousands were trampled in the narrow mountain gorges as the Persian Empire crumbled. That night, Alexander stepped into Darius's captured royal tent, filled with gold bathtubs, exotic perfumes, and silver flagons. He remarked, "This, it seems, was to be a king." When an attendant corrected her in horror, Alexander gently raised the weeping queen mother to her feet, smiling, "Do not be distressed, mother. He too is Alexander." In early 332 BC, Alexander marched south along the Levantine coast. City after city surrendered, but the island fortress of Tyre refused to submit. Situated half a mile offshore, Tyre was deemed impregnable. Its colossal stone walls soared 150 feet directly out of the deep Mediterranean waters. When Tyrian envoys barred Alexander from sacrificing at their sacred temple of Melkart, the king was outraged. He vowed to show them they were no longer on an island. Without a fleet, Alexander conceived an unprecedented engineering marvel, constructing a massive 200-foot wide stone causeway across half a mile of open sea. Thousands of soldiers tore down the ruins of old Tyre for stone and felled the ancient cedars of Mount Lebanon, driving a mountain into the Mediterranean. As the mole entered deep water under missile fire from the walls, Alexander erected 2 towering 150-foot siege engines covered in rawhide. The Tyrians launched a devastating counterstrike, a specially modified fireship packed with pitch, sulfur, and cauldrons of boiling oil sailed straight for the towers. In minutes, months of labor went up in flames. Both giant siege engines collapsed into the sea. Yet watching from the shore, Alexander refused to retreat. Recognizing that Tyre could only fall by sea, Alexander secured 224 warships from Cyprus and Phoenicia, turning the hunter into the hunted. The Allied fleet bottled up Tyre's 2 harbors, severing all reinforcement from Carthage. The island was completely isolated, trapped in an iron vice. Alexander mounted giant battering rams onto pairs of lashed warships, relentlessly pounding the weaker southern seawall until the colossal masonry began to fracture. In July 332 BC, the wall collapsed. Lowering a boarding bridge from his flagship, Alexander charged across the timber gangway, directly into the smoking breach. A savage battle raged across the battlements. Fighting with reckless fury, Alexander and his elite hypaspists cleared the towers, opening the city to total destruction. After 7 months of agonizing siege, Tyre fell. 8,000 citizens were slain in the storm, and 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. Inside the sacred temple of Melkart, Alexander finally made his sacrifice. The Mediterranean was secured, and the road to Egypt lay wide open. South of Tyre lay Gaza, the heavily fortified desert gateway to Egypt, guarded by the fiercely loyal Persian governor, Batis. Perched atop a towering 250-foot sand mound, the fortress of Gaza was believed immune to siege engines, defying Alexander's advance. Alexander commanded his engineers to achieve the impossible, constructing a colossal earthen mound, encircling the entire fortress to match its height. During a ferocious assault on the ramparts, a heavy catapult bolt pierced Alexander's bronze shield, driving deep into his shoulder. Despite his agonizing wound, Alexander directed the final assault. Battering rams pulverized the walls, and Macedonian soldiers flooded through the breach. Gaza was subjugated after 2 grueling months. With the fortress obliterated, the path across the Sinai Desert to Egypt lay entirely defenseless. In late 332 BC, Alexander entered Egypt not as a brutal conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing the Nile from Persian tyranny. At the frontier fortress of Pelusium, Persian satrap Mezases surrendered the province without drawing a single sword, handing over 800 talents. Riding into the ancient capital of Memphis, Alexander was greeted by jubilant crowds lining the palm-fringed banks of the sacred Nile. Unlike the Persian king Cambyses, who had slaughtered the sacred Apis bull, Alexander bowed before Egyptian gods, offering reverent traditional sacrifices. In the sacred temple of Ptah, high priests crowned 24-year-old Alexander as pharaoh, placing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt upon his brow. Sailing north to the Mediterranean coast, Alexander scouted a narrow limestone spit of land, situated between Lake Mareotis and the sea. Envisioning the commercial and intellectual capital of the ancient world, Alexander personally designed the layout of the grand city that would bear his name. Lacking chalk to trace the urban grid, Alexander ordered barley meal from soldier rations spread across the earth to outline streets, agoras, and temples. In early 331 BC, Alexander embarked on a perilous spiritual pilgrimage, marching 300 miles across the unforgiving Libyan desert to the remote oracle of Siwa. Accompanied only by a small retinue of trusted companions, the king rode into the Great Sand Sea, driven by a deep psychological need to discover his divine origin. Days into the journey, disaster struck. A violent sandstorm wiped out all landmarks. Water supplies ran dangerously dry, and the guides completely lost their way. Then, an unseasonable downpour erupted over the scorching sands. The Macedonians caught the miraculous water in their bronze helmets, saved from certain death. According to royal historians Callisthenes and Ptolemy, 2 ravens appeared in the sky, croaking loudly and leading the lost caravan directly toward the hidden oasis. After weeks in the barren wastes, the travelers beheld the legendary Siwa Oasis, an emerald paradise of date palms and natural springs, hidden amidst the Sahara. Leaving his companions behind, Alexander ascended the stone steps of the Acropolis of Agarmi alone, approaching the archaic sanctuary of the Oracle of Amun. Inside the shadowy Adyton, surrounded by thick clouds of burning myrrh, the young conqueror stood face to face with the aged high priest of the god. Attempting to greet Alexander in Greek as, "O Padian, O my child," the priest's Egyptian accent slipped, uttering instead, "O Paidios, O son of God." Alexander asked whether all his father's murderers had been punished, and if he was destined to rule the entire earth. The oracle answered that his destiny was absolute. Emerging into the brilliant desert sun, Alexander was transformed. He would no longer see himself merely as the king of Macedon, but as a living demigod. In May 331 BC, Alexander turned his army eastward into Asia. 47,000 battle-hardened veterans marched to deliver the final death blow to the Persian Empire. At Bucephalus, engineers spanned the mighty Euphrates River with twin pontoon bridges, allowing the entire invasion force to cross into Mesopotamia unopposed. On September 20th, 331 BC, after crossing the treacherous Tigris, a blood-red lunar eclipse struck the night sky. The stage for Gaugamela was set. On the eve of battle, General Parmenion urged a surprise night attack. Alexander famously replied, "I will not steal my victory." Across the plain, Hundreds of thousands of Persian campfires burned like a terrifying sea of stars, striking fear into Macedonian hearts. On the morning of October 1st, 331 BC, Alexander overslept so deeply that his anxious generals had to shake him awake. Before them lay the vast, dusty plain of Gaugamela, leveled by Darius to unleash 200 deadly scythed war chariots. Darius commanded over 100,000 soldiers, 15 Indian war elephants, and the elite immortals, confident of total annihilation. Alexander began the battle with a bizarre maneuver, marching his cavalry diagonally to the right, drawing the Persian cavalry with him. Darius unleashed his scythed chariots, their 3-foot steel blades spinning violently from wheel hubs, hurtling toward the Macedonian line. Disciplined phalangites simply parted ranks, creating open lanes. The deadly chariots passed harmlessly through and were neutralized from behind. As Persian cavalry stretched out to intercept Alexander's flanking move, a fatal tear opened in the Persian center-left line. Alexander had anticipated this exact moment. He formed his companions into a massive triangular strike wedge, aimed directly at Darius. With a terrifying war cry, the wedge drove violently into the breach, striking straight at the great king through blinding dust. Overcome with terror, as Alexander closed within spear length, Darius wheeled his chariot and fled, shattering the morale of his empire. Victory was almost lost on the left, where General Parmenion was surrounded and pleaded desperately for royal assistance. Alexander broke off his pursuit of Darius to relieve Parmenion. Gaugamela was won. Alexander was now king of Asia. In late October, 331 BC, Alexander made his triumphant entry into Babylon, riding through the magnificent blue-glazed Ishtar Gate amidst cheering crowds. In the royal vaults of Babylon and Susa, Alexander seized over 75,000 talents of gold and silver wealth, beyond anything Greece had ever imagined. In Susa, Alexander sat upon the great king's towering throne. Because his legs dangled short, an attendant placed a golden table under his feet. In January 330 BC, Alexander marched into the heart of Persia. Blocking the narrow pass of the Persian Gate stood 40,000 loyal defenders under satrap Ariobarzanes. From the towering heights above, Persian defenders hurled massive boulders and catapult stones into the bottleneck, slaughtering the trapped vanguard in a devastating ambush. Repulsed for the first time, Alexander took local captives as guides, leading an elite force along a treacherous, snow-choked goat path around the Persian rear. At dawn, Alexander blew the trumpets and charged down the snowy ridge. The Persians found themselves trapped in a deadly pincer between two Macedonian armies. Ariobarzanes and his men fought heroically to the last warrior. The final barrier had fallen. The road to the sacred Persian capital was wide open. In early 330 BC, Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial crown jewel of the Achaemenid Empire and spiritual heart of Persian majesty. Walking beneath the 72 towering columns of the Apadana, Alexander stood where Darius the Great and Xerxes had once held court over the known world. In May 330 BC, after months of occupation, a lavish drunken banquet took place in the cedar-paneled halls of the royal palace. Inflamed by wine and vengeance, Alexander leaped from his couch. Crowned with flowers, he led a wild, torchlit procession through the grand palatial corridors. With a roar of triumph, Alexander hurled the first flaming brand into the dry Lebanese cedarwood rafters, followed immediately by Thais and his commanders. In a single night of drunken madness, the greatest palace complex of the ancient world was consumed by fire, reducing 2 centuries of Persian imperial majesty to ashes. In the scorching summer of 330 BC, Alexander launched a desperate forced march of 400 miles in 11 days to capture Darius III alive. Riding day and night across the barren Dashti Kavir salt desert, hundreds of horses collapsed dead from sheer exhaustion beneath the blistering sun. When scouts offered him a helmet of scarce water, Alexander refused to drink while his men thirsted, pouring it out upon the sand. Ahead on the trail, the traitorous satrap Bessus panicked, refusing to let Darius fall into Macedonian hands. The conspirators repeatedly stabbed their captive emperor. Minutes later, Alexander reached the abandoned wagon near Hekatompelos. Inside lay the last great king of Persia, dead in golden chains. Overcome with grief for his fallen rival, Alexander wept. He unclasped his own royal purple cloak and gently draped it over the body of Darius. Alexander sent the body to Persepolis, with orders that Darius be buried with full imperial honors in the royal tombs beside his ancestors. Proclaiming himself the legitimate heir to the Achaemenids, Alexander adopted Persian royal dress, the white diadem, purple robes, and golden sash. He appointed Persian nobles as satraps and integrated Persian cavalry into the royal army, seeking to fuse the conquered and conquerors into a single empire. To freeborn Greeks and Macedonians, prostrating before a mortal king was blasphemous. Resentment festered among the veteran officers who had bled for him. Paranoia took root in Alexander's mind. Surrounded by whispers of conspiracy, the king began to see treason in the eyes of his oldest friends. In October 330 BC, a plot to assassinate Alexander was uncovered. Philotas, commander of the Companion Cavalry and Parmenian's son, was accused of treason. Tortured mercilessly by Hephaestion and Craterus, Philotas broke, confessing to a conspiracy. He was condemned by the army and executed by javelins. Alexander knew Parmenion would seek vengeance for his son. He dispatched racing couriers across 600 miles of desert with secret, fatal orders. In Ecbatana, 70-year-old Parmenion was walking in his palace garden when trusted officers handed him a letter from his king and stabbed him to death. Between 329 and 327 BC, Alexander plunged into Central Asia, fighting a brutal, bloody guerrilla war against the fierce horsemen of Bactria and Sogdia. In spring 327 BC, Sogdian rebels withdrew into the Sogdian Rock, a sheer vertical cliff fortress, taunting that Alexander would need winged soldiers to capture it. Alexander assembled 300 expert rock climbers. In the dead of night, using iron tent pegs and flax ropes, they scaled the icy, vertical precipice. At dawn, Alexander pointed to the summit, announcing he had found his winged soldiers. Terrified by the impossible feat, the Sogdian defenders surrendered immediately. Among the highborn captives was Roxana, the teenage daughter of nobleman Oxyartes, renowned by contemporaries as the loveliest woman in all of Asia. Refusing to take her as a concubine, Alexander married Roxana, according to Sogdian custom, sharing a sacred loaf of bread cut in two with his sword. In the autumn of 328 BC, at Mariconda, heavy drinking inflamed royal hubris. Sycophantic poets began singing verses that exalted Alexander above his father Philip. Clitus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, snapped in drunken fury, shouting that all Alexander's glory was built on Philip's blood. Tearfully restrained by Ptolemy and Hephaestion, Alexander broke violently free. He snatched an iron-tipped spear from a royal bodyguard's hands. The wine's intoxication vanished instantly. Clitus collapsed dead. Alexander stared in paralyzed horror at the man who had saved his life at the Granicus. For 3 days and 3 nights, Alexander locked himself in his chamber, weeping inconsolably, refusing food, and repeatedly trying to take his own life. In 327 BC, royal pages plotted Alexander's murder. Court historian Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew who opposed divine honors, was arrested and died in chains. With Central Asia pacified, Alexander looked beyond the mountains toward legendary India. An army of 120,000 gathered to cross the Hindu Kush. In late 327 BC, Alexander led his multinational host across the freezing peaks of the Hindu Kush, descending toward the mysterious, mythic subcontinent of India. In May 326 BC, in the lush Punjab, Alexander reached the swollen Hydaspes River, where King Porus guarded the opposite bank with 200 war elephants. Porus deployed 200 massive war elephants spaced across his front like living fortress towers, designed to terrify and panic the Macedonian cavalry horses. Under cover of a howling monsoon thunderstorm, Alexander led 11,000 elite troops 17 miles upriver, crossing the raging torrent on stuffed skin floats and wooden galleys. Landing at dawn on an isolated island, soldiers waded through chest-deep channels to reach the mainland, ready to fight the bloodiest battle of their lives. An Indian vanguard of 60 chariots under Porus's son was trapped in the deep mud. Alexander's cavalry slaughtered the force, killing the young prince. King Porus, a giant warrior over 6 feet 4 inches tall, personally commanded the center atop his massive royal elephant, ready for the clash of titans. Refusing to charge the terrifying elephants head-on, Alexander swept his cavalry around the Indian flanks, executing a brilliant double envelopment in the mud. The phalanx engaged the beasts. The colossal monsters trampled soldiers in the mud, goring men on iron-tipped tusks and hurling warriors with giant trunks. Macedonians fought back with curved axes and scythes, chopping at trunks and hamstrings until the blinded, maddened beasts turned and trampled their own Indian ranks. Despite sustaining 9 severe wounds, King Porus fought on heroically from his elephant until blood loss overwhelmed him, commanding Alexander's deep admiration. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Treat me, Alexander, like a king." Impressed, Alexander restored his throne and added new territories. The victory exacted an unbearable personal price. Alexander's 30-year-old black stallion, Bucephalus, died of battle wounds. Weeping, Alexander founded the city of Bucephala in his honor. For 70 consecutive days, relentless tropical monsoon rains battered the army. Armor rusted, clothes rotted off bodies, and venomous snakes infested their waterlogged camps. At the Hyphasis River, terrifying rumors spread. Across the Ganges, the Nanda Empire awaited with 200,000 infantry, 80,000 cavalry, and 6,000 war elephants. The army mutinied. General Coenus wept, declaring the men could march no further. Undefeated against all mortal foes, Alexander was finally defeated by his own army. Before turning back, Alexander erected 12 colossal 70-foot stone altars on the banks of the Hyphasis, marking the easternmost boundary of his immortal empire. Returning to the Hydaspes, Alexander assembled over 1,000 river transports and war galleys, preparing to conquer the southward path to the Great Ocean. In November 326 BC, Alexander stood at his flagship's prow, pouring libations from a golden cup to the gods of the river and ocean as trumpets sounded the grand departure. In early 325 BC, the army encountered the Malians, the most warlike tribe in India, who retreated into their fortified brick citadel, determined to fight to the death. Impatient with his soldiers' hesitation, under a heavy missile barrage, Alexander seized a wooden scaling ladder, set it against the wall, and began climbing alone. Reaching the battlements, Alexander stood alone on the wall. Behind him, the overloaded ladder snapped with a loud crack, cutting off all reinforcement. Rather than leap back to safety, Alexander leaped down inside the enemy fortress, planting his back against a sacred banyan tree to fight alone. Fighting with godlike fury, he struck down the Malian commander and 3 champions, holding an entire army at bay with his sword and shield. An Indian archer drew a 6-foot bamboo longbow, firing a 3-foot arrow that pierced Alexander's bronze cuirass, puncturing his left lung. As Alexander collapsed unconscious, his bodyguard Bucephalus covered him with the sacred Trojan shield of Athena, while Leonatus defended the fallen king to the death. Believing their king was dead, enraged Macedonian soldiers smashed the citadel gates into kindling, flooding the fortress in an uncontrollable fury of revenge. Carried onto his royal riverboat, Alexander had his canopy removed and weakly raised his arm. The entire army wept with overwhelming joy, seeing their king alive. Reaching the Indian Ocean in autumn 325 BC, Alexander divided his forces. Nearchus sailed by sea, while Alexander chose to march across the uncharted Gedrosian desert. For 60 days in the Gedrosian furnace, temperatures exceeded 120 degrees. Men butchered baggage mules for blood and drank boiling sand. A sudden mountain flash flood drowned thousands of sleeping camp followers in a dry wadi. Over 12,000 perished before Alexander emerged from the desert hell. In early 324 BC at Susa, Alexander staged a colossal mass wedding, marrying Darius's daughter, Statira, while 80 Macedonian officers married noble Persian brides. At Opis, veterans revolted over Persian favoritism. Leaping onto the rostrum, Alexander shamed them, roaring, "Go home and tell them you left your king in the care of conquered barbarians." Repentant, the soldiers wept and reconciled. Alexander hosted a banquet for 9,000 guests, praying for harmony and partnership between Greeks and Persians. In autumn 324 BC at Ecbatana, tragedy struck. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, cavalry commander, and soulmate, collapsed with a violent fever. Hephaestion died. Alexander went mad with grief, lying across the corpse for a day and a night, cutting his hair like Achilles mourning Patroclus. In Babylon, Alexander erected a colossal 200-foot funeral pyre, costing 12,000 talents, consuming vast fortunes of gold and cedar, in grief. Chaldean astrologers warned Alexander that entering Babylon looking westward would bring death. Dismissing their omens as superstition, the king rode inside. On May 29, 323 BC, at a drinking party hosted by Medius, Alexander downed the massive golden cup of Heracles, suddenly crying out in agonizing back pain. For 11 grueling days, a terrifying fever consumed his body. His organs deteriorated, his strength evaporated, and by the 10th day, his voice had vanished. Believing rumors that he was already dead, the Macedonian army demanded to see him. In a silent procession, thousands of weeping veterans filed past his bed. Removing his royal signet ring, Alexander handed it to Perdiccas. With his dying breath, he whispered, "To the strongest." On June 11, 323 BC, Alexander died. 2 years later, Ptolemy hijacked Alexander's colossal golden funeral carriage, diverting his mummified body to Alexandria, where his tomb became a shrine for Roman emperors. Without a designated heir, Alexander's generals tore the empire apart. For 40 years of bloody civil war, the Diadochi carved kingdoms from the corpse of his empire. Yet Alexander's true conquest was cultural. He spread Greek language, science, and art from the Nile to the Indus, laying the foundations of the Hellenistic age. In 32 years of life, he never lost a battle. He conquered the known world, becoming an eternal legend whose name echoes across millennia.